So I'd like to officially welcome everybody to this webinar, which is an initiative of the Poverty and Inequality Partnership, a research and impact partnership between ACOSS and the University of New South Wales. I'm joining this meeting from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and if you'd like to, you can acknowledge country in the chat function. We are just delighted and overwhelmed by the number of registrations that we've had today for this webinar and the high level of interest that there is amongst our networks and civil society and academia in this research. So thank you so much for joining today. The Poverty and Inequality Partnership, as I said, is a joint initiative by ACOSS and the University of New South Wales. It's a research and impact partnership that's really committed to using the latest and best available evidence and leveraging that evidence to try and achieve policy impacts. That is by influencing the systemic and structural policy drivers of poverty and inequality. We're now in the second 5-year phase of the partnership, and we have a large stable now of partners, including philanthropic and NGO partners, who very generously commit financially every year to the partnership, as well as in a myriad of other ways on steering committees and working groups to guide the direction of the partnership. I won't list them all because there are a lot, but I want to sincerely thank all of you who are on the call, and we will share a link. I think Penny Dorsch from ACOSS has popped a link into the partnership website, which has a full list of our partners, but also a full list of partnership publications and data. So you can download graphs, charts and tables of all of the latest research for your own purposes. So today we are going to be hearing from the Vice-Chancellor initially with some opening remarks by video link. And then we have Professor Carla Treloar, who has led the research that we're hearing about today and is also the lead from UNSW in the Poverty and Inequality Partnership. And we're very fortunate to also be joined today by Mark Chenery, who is going to, I suppose, respond to Carla's research and talk about its implications, how we use that as advocates for poverty reduction. And then there will be time for Q&A at the end if I chair this sufficiently enough. So there are a lot of people in the webinar, which is so fantastic. That does mean, though, that for Q&A purposes, we're asking you to post your questions in the chat, and I will moderate and pose those questions to our speakers as we go. We are recording the webinar for later uploading, so please note that. And so just by way of introduction, those of you who are not familiar with the partnership, we have been publishing for some time now reports on the level and extent of poverty and inequality in Australia. I'm really excited about this webinar today. This is the first time that we have published research on community attitudes to poverty, and this reflects a broadening out of our research agenda to be, I suppose, more multidimensional, continuing on with our poverty line research and analysis, but complementing that with a new stream of research on deprivation, on community attitudes, and on the lived experience of poverty. So using quantitative, but also increasingly qualitative research approaches as well to tell, I suppose, a fuller and richer story about poverty and inequality in Australia. Final bit of housekeeping, you are all being muted and I think cameras are off on entry, as I said, because we have so many people. Please use the chat function for questions or comments. So without any further ado, let's move now to hear from the Vice-Chancellor, Attila Brungs from UNSW. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks, Jackie. And I've already had one massive tech fail today, so I'm hoping I can pull this one off, but not sure. Is it loading as a full slide? Great. Okay.
Yep, there you go.
I'm going to play a short video from our Vice-Chancellor, and this is more than a symbolic thing. UNSW contributes financially to the Poverty and Inequality Partnership, and I'm so thrilled that Attila Brungs is a relatively new Vice-Chancellor here, so coming in to support the second phase of the partnership, sees the impact and the importance of this work and puts money where the university's mouth is. So I'm going to hopefully play this successfully.
Hello, my name is Attila Brungs and I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President here at UNSW. I am delighted to introduce this Social Policy Research Centre webinar exploring community attitudes towards poverty and inequality in Australia, the latest research findings and how to talk about them. The partnership between ACOSS, the Australian Council of Social Service, and UNSW is a leading model for research-informed advocacy and societal impact. The ACOSS-UNSW Poverty and Inequality Partnership leads research and policy debate and influences action to tackle poverty and disadvantage. I am very proud of this partnership. Our collaboration monitors trends in poverty and equality over time. It dives deep to explore the drivers of poverty and informs policy. I would like to congratulate the team in the Poverty and Inequality Partnership on producing more than 20 reports. This is robust research, the evidence needed to drive policies that can really address poverty and inequality more effectively. I would like to thank the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW for its wonderful work on this project and acknowledge and thank the support of ACOSS, partner organisations and the lived experience experts in guiding this research. Community attitudes are an important part of building support for policy reform to reduce poverty and inequality. Today is an opportunity to discuss the findings of a recent survey of Australian public undertaken as part of this Poverty and Inequality Partnership. We will be joined by Mark Chenery, co-founder and director of Common Cause Australia, Scientia Professor Carla Treloar from the UNSW Social Policy Research Centre, and Jacqueline Phillips, Director of Policy and Advocacy at ACOSS. Highlighting the attitudes of the Australian community towards inequality can inform shifts in social policies that can create better outcomes for everyone. UNSW is, as I said, very proud to work with ACOSS in this partnership, and I hope that you find the webinar and the work informative and inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Attila, and for introducing me, because I forgot to do that part. So we might just segue straight from there into Carla's presentation, given that she's driving the slide deck. So Carla, as Attila said, is Scientia Professor with the Centre for Social Research in Health and the Social Policy Research Centre. She is, as I said, also the lead on the Poverty and Inequality Partnership from the UNSW side. Her research focuses on ways in which health and social systems can do better for people who are in marginalised circumstances, and she's led this research. Over to you, Carla.
Thanks, and I just quickly flicked off that slide so we didn't have Christmas jazz accompanying your talk there,
Thank
Jack. So in doing this research, it is a partnership, and I wanted to upfront thank the support from the Vice-Chancellor and the Alliances team at UNSW, and the researchers across UNSW listed here, and also we've got a fantastic partnership with George Washington University around attitudes research via Sarah Calabrese. And we started this work with a workshop back in March where the member organisations of PIP, as listed on the side there, were present, as were a number of lived experience experts who've helped us with this research. And I'm really thankful to everyone involved for thinking through a new piece of work for the partnership. And of course, I also want to thank Mark from Common Cause for coming along on this journey with us, and really looking forward to the discussion coming up. So why community attitudes? Well, Attila kind of outlined why we were interested in this, that community attitudes are important for policy support amongst the public and amongst decision makers. And we can also use understandings of community attitude in our own communications, understanding where there might be misinformation about issues, the directions of attitudes that we measure amongst community, and where and how different segments of the population might be persuadable by the types of messaging or campaigning that the sector wants to do. And I also come from a long experience working in health with measuring community attitudes and have that background of a powerful research advocacy relationship. And so I just wanted to show you where this is coming from. So we've been measuring amongst the general public attitudes to HIV for a number of years, since 2017. And we produce these graphs periodically, and our partner organisations in the HIV sector use these very regularly to talk to politicians, to talk to media, to talk to health services, that stigma towards HIV has not gone away, and that these are powerful data in the last round in 2021 to show that 50% of the general public would behave negatively towards someone because of their HIV status. And it was on the background of being able to produce these data, see its impact in the community sector, that we thought this launching into attitudes towards poverty and inequality could help us on this pathway to think about ways in which we could use these data for impact. I'm also taking a bit of inspiration from this great book, if people haven't read it before, by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, about why equality is better for everyone. And I just really like this quote. You know, we think it's a mistake to discuss policy as if it were a matter of finding the right technical fix, as there are really hundreds of ways that societies can become more equal if they choose to. What we need is not so much a clever solution as a society which recognises the benefits of greater equality. And I guess that's another aim of this work, is to provide this information into public dialogue, into the social consciousness of our Australian population, so we can start or continue this conversation about what equality is and what our communities think and understand about it. So onto this report. It's beautifully designed. Thank you, Penny, for all your amazing work on this. And we've got links to the website where you can download this report. It is the 22nd in our series, and I wanted to do something quite different, which was produce a very light touch report with some headline results to really get a view on how people are responding to these data. So it was a survey of the Australian community, 2,000 people via a Qualtrics panel, which is a company that lots of researchers use to pick up general community type and other population for surveys. And we asked them to select 2,000 people that were representative of age, gender, and across the states and territories. We also recruited via income quintile, and there'll be analyses to come in 2024. But for this analysis, and thanks very much to Bruce Bradbury for directing us here, we weighted this 2,000 people so that they match the patterns across the Australian community in relation to age and gender, education, voting at the last federal election, and income. And this was actually picked up in a media interview I did yesterday, where the journalist said, but you know, you've got X% of people agreeing with whatever. How do you know that there's just not X% of very particular type of people? And I was able to point to this weighting process to say, actually, it's our 2,000 people are representative of the Australian community. So that was a very great intervention there. Thank you, Bruce. So to jump into the data, in doing these this media work yesterday, I kind of came up with a different pattern of how to present it. So I have, if you're looking at the report, I'm not going from graph number 1 through to the end. I've moved it around a little bit. And the story I spoke to the media yesterday was, first of all, we wanted to understand what Australians believe about poverty and inequality in Australia. And we saw this data that 69% of people agreed that poverty is a big problem. And even more, 83% indicated that Australia should be a country that looks after those in need. So trying to flesh out the story of what Australians want their country to look like. And going a bit further with that, we asked questions about, what do you think about inequality? Well, yes, large proportions indicating that the gap between the rich and the not rich is too large, that incomes at the bottom are too low and should be increased, and incomes at the top are too high and should be reduced. And I know Mark's got a bit to say about that later. So in these data, we're presenting the picture. Here's Australians' understanding of their world and what they want it to look like. It gets a little bit interesting, though, when we dive into thinking about Australians overall, and then people receiving unemployment payments. So on the figures 6 and 7 here, we've got large proportions in the 80% saying people can experience poverty through no fault of their own and nobody deserves to live in poverty. When we ask those same questions about people receiving unemployment payments, the results are a little bit different. So not too different on the first ones, can find themselves needing unemployment payments through no fault of their own. But this notion of people receiving unemployment payments do not deserve to live in poverty, we see quite a drop in the general question, figure 7, and when we ask it about people receiving unemployment payments in figure 10. But generally, we've got a picture that we want our fellow people in Australia to not suffer hardship, and we want this to be a country that looks after people who are in need. Then we asked questions about, well, what's the government's role in this? So at the top, 62% of people agreeing that government has a role in causing some people to experience poverty, and a bit higher, 75% agreeing that poverty is a problem that can be solved with the right systems and policies. So in media yesterday, I was saying, yep, we've got this picture of what we want Australia to be, and then we've got endorsement generally, with the majority of people in the survey indicating that government has a role in both causing and solving poverty and inequality. And then we moved on to, well, one particular policy that we asked about was unemployment benefits. So when we asked people, is it okay if people receiving unemployment payments had to skip meals or not see the doctor when they need, we've got really high rates of people saying that's not what they want. In the 80% of people saying people shouldn't have to skip meals and they shouldn't miss out on seeing the doctor when they need. And I think this is my last slide. When we asked people, could you live on the current rate of unemployment payment? We had 23% indicating that they could, but the vast majority saying no, they couldn't, or they were unsure if they could. So to use these data to tell the story to media yesterday of here's the picture we want Australia to be, government has a role, the Australian population believes government has a role, and those policies include unemployment payments where we don't want people to miss out or to have to compromise on the things that we all take for granted of being able to have a meal and see a doctor when you need. So I'm going to stop there because part of the process of this webinar is to hear what other perspectives on how we should be telling this story or framing up this story. So I'm going to stop sharing this and hand back to you, Jacqueline.
Thank you. And that's a beautiful segue to Mark, who is an expert storyteller in a way. So Mark's a communications expert and trainer who works with mission-driven organisations, like many of you on the call, and political parties to incorporate values-based messaging. Since establishing Common Cause Australia in 2014, he and his colleagues have trained more than 5,000 campaigners, communicators and fundraisers from Australia and New Zealand in the science of values and framing. So over to you, Mark, to respond to Carla's research and talk more broadly about how we talk about poverty and inequality in Australia today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jackie. Hey, everyone. So yeah, and thanks for that introduction. So what I want to do today is talk about what I think are some insights from this research that we can use to boost support for actions to address poverty and inequality, acknowledging that a lot of the results are quite positive here, right? We've got some excellent statistics around community support already, although there is clearly some room to both increase the number of people who are agreeing with the things we want them to agree with, but also strengthening that agreement. So more people strongly agreeing, if you like. But before I go into sharing sort of a couple of frame shifts I think might be helpful for us all to think about in our work and communicating our work, I want to say a few quick words about cognitive framing. So cognitive framing is a discipline that underpins our approach to communication and message research and message analysis at Common Cause. And one of the things that's important to sort of to acknowledge early on is that while I wish human beings were capable of rationality, and we are in fact capable of rationality, we don't use that rationality the vast majority of the time. So most of the time, as we go about our lives and we make decisions big and small, we are far more driven by subconscious processes and reasoning and heuristics and values and emotional cues. So cognitive scientists estimate at least 95% of human thought happens at sort of below this level of subconscious awareness. And so if we want to understand how to motivate people, how to bring people on board with a cause, we have to understand how do we influence the way they feel about issues. One of the things that influences how people feel about issues is the perspective that they're taking on that issue in any moment. And what you're looking at here is a visual illusion. So you should be able to eventually, as you look around this, see two things, a duck or a bird of some description looking to the left, and a rabbit looking in the opposite direction to the right. Now, this illusion illustrates quite an important concept in cognitive framing, which is that of biconceptualism, the ability of human beings to perceive the exact same thing and sometimes the exact same facts, in this case, visual facts, from different perspectives. And it's quite a challenging concept or challenging to the way we tend to think about communications, because there's a piece of advice that you've no doubt heard in your life, you've probably given it to others, and that is that we need to meet our audience where they're at. Now, that's good advice from the perspective of the better we know our audiences, this is why we do audience research like this, the better we can engage with them and talk to them and connect with them. But it's also hugely misleading advice if we take it to mean that there's a fixed place where our audience is at, where we must meet them. The reality is that most people can perceive most issues, including poverty and inequality, from multiple different perspectives. And depending on the perspective that they are thinking about that issue from in the moment that they're reasoning about it, they can arrive at quite dramatically different conclusions as to what they're actually even seeing, and therefore what should be done about it, and therefore how they feel about it. So if we want to boost support, if we want to make people feel like our solutions are the right ones, it is crucial to think about how we're framing the facts before us. So it's not enough just to do the research, to find the facts. We've got to think about how do we present them and which facts are helping us tell our story more than others. Now, I've got an excellent example of biconceptualism from this research that Carla already touched on, and that is a couple of questions from this survey. The first one asked people to what extent they agreed with the following statement, that nobody deserves to live in poverty. And we've got 86% agreement, which is fantastic, right? And quite strong agreement. Look at that, 59% strongly agree. So this is excellent and heartwarming and great. However, when the question later on in the survey was framed a little bit differently like this, people who receive unemployment benefits do not deserve to live in poverty, we've got a dramatically different result and significantly reduced strong agreement, which is telling us that there is something about this second question which is changing the way people feel, how right it feels to agree that nobody deserves to live in poverty. And it's important to recognize that this is logically impossible, right, to agree with both of these perspectives. But there's about 27% of Australians who change the way they feel as soon as unemployment is brought into the equation. And what this tells us is that what's happening here is a frame shift. The way in which, the lens through which people are thinking about this, thinking about their fellow human beings and community members shifts once attention is brought to unemployment. So this is obviously a problem. It's clear that there is a stigma here that might be sitting under the surface that we're not always recognizing. So how do we address that? I've got a couple of suggestions for how that might happen. Now, these are suggestions that come from not specific message testing research on poverty and inequality, although we've done a little bit of that, but also from a whole range of other topic areas through dozens of sort of in-depth message testing projects with Australians over the last few years. Now, the first messaging or frame shift that I want to invite you to think about and to incorporate into your communications around poverty, just generally, whether or not it's this report that you're talking about, is the need to move away from the individual choice and responsibility frame and how we might go about that. So individual choice and responsibility as a concept is a foundational concept for many Australians. It's a very, very strong, dominant frame. And it's a very problematic frame because when we think about issues from the perspective of choice and responsibility of individuals, there's a few logical things that happen. We assume that people who make good choices enjoy better outcomes, and people who make poor choices enjoy worse outcomes. And therefore, people who enjoy or suffer perhaps from poor outcomes in life probably have made some poor choices. And that's obviously a very stigmatizing frame around poverty that we don't want. The other problem with the individual choice and responsibility frame is when it is active, when people are thinking through that frame, or when we use messages that accidentally activate it or even do so on purpose, the effect is a reduced support for policy interventions. Because if individuals created the problem, then surely the most logical, intuitive solution is for individuals to fix it, to go from bad choices to good choices. And so at most, what people tend to support when they're thinking through this frame, when it comes to things like poverty, would be, well, government should do things to help people make better choices, but ultimately it is on them. And what that does is it means that solutions that involve addressing the true systemic causes of poverty don't feel quite as right because individuals aren't at the center. So the solution to that is to shift the frame, to make sure that when we are talking about poverty, that we introduce other actors, other systemic actors, and the choices that they are making that create or worsen or deprive people of the ability to escape poverty. So that would be industry and business and employers, or government perhaps, or the finance system and people working in banks, whatever it is, other actors that are making choices in their day-to-day lives and in their professions that create poverty, that reinforce it. And through my analysis of a limited amount of discourse around poverty, that is rarely the case. We are rarely bringing these actors very clearly into the conversation. Instead, we either talk about individuals and their experiences of poverty, not trying to blame them, but talking about how poverty impacts on individuals means that they're the only ones in the story. They're the only ones we're focused on. The other way that we unintentionally sort of reinforce or don't counter the individual choice frame is when we don't mention who's to blame at all. Not saying who is to blame, but just talking about poverty as a challenge and solutions to poverty means that we're not saying who's to blame. Now, people struggle to not find causation. So when we are thinking or hearing about a topic, we automatically jump to, but why? Why is it happening? And if we in our messaging aren't pointing to these external actors and the choices that they are making, then our audience will fill in the gaps in our story with their own assumptions. And given the dominance of individual choice and responsibility, that's often where it's going to land. So that's my first recommendation is think about who is and isn't in our messaging. Who are we naming when we are talking about poverty, and who are we not? And who should we be focusing on? The other framing shift is around how we frame the problem and what is the problem, in fact. Now, a lot of the time when we are talking about the issues that we're trying to solve and the solutions that we want, we frame the problem as poverty, as if poverty is a thing that we need to fix. And in some ways that's true. We don't like poverty. We think that poverty is a problem. But when we focus on that in our communication, it does a couple of things. On the one hand, it limits people's ability to see outside of poverty, because poverty doesn't exist in isolation. It exists within an economic system, within a system that is highly unequal. It also means that we're focused more on people who are experiencing poverty. So it also brings us back to that individual choice frame more often than not. So a solution to that is still to talk about poverty, but to talk about it within the broader frame of inequality. And one way to do that in framing terms, what leads sets the frame. So if I was talking about poverty and inequality, I would actually flip those two around, and I'd start by introducing the topic of inequality. and talk about how that impacts on poverty, how poverty is an outcome of an unequal system or unequal rules, however you want to frame it. Now, what inequality does as a frame is it opens us up to feel like more systemic solutions make sense. So, for example, if we are in the poverty frame, poverty is the problem, we've got to fix poverty, how do we do it? Then things like stage 3 tax cuts and cancelling them doesn't quite make sense to people. Because sure, I might worry about and feel sorry for people experiencing tough times, but why should people who are successful and doing well in life, why should they be punished? That doesn't feel right. However, when we are focused on inequality, all of a sudden that makes a whole bunch of sense, right? Because these concepts are connected. The good news is that most Australians think that poverty is a big problem. So 69%. The even better news is that even more people think that inequality is a problem and they want something done about it. So the gap between rich and poor is too great and should be reduced. So not only is inequality as a frame a more useful frame for advancing a broader range of objectives and solutions, it is also a more resonant frame. It is actually easier and more emotive to engage in the community. So that's my second tip there, is to focus more on inequality than poverty. Talk about all the issues, talk about all the solutions around poverty, but frame that as a problem of inequality. Now, an extension to focusing on inequality as the problem is actually to shift us away even more from people experiencing poverty to those experiencing extreme wealth, to wealth hoarding. Now, that's the flip side of inequality, because in a system that generates inequalities, the wealth that is generated at the top doesn't come from nowhere. It is wealth that otherwise would be or could be shared more broadly, and therefore would reduce poverty, would reduce inequality. So talk about extreme wealth, talk about the problems that that creates and how that contributes to inequality. Now, this is not something that we talk about a lot in Australia. We don't talk about extreme wealth. We don't talk about wealth hoarding as a problem. Civil society doesn't talk about it much. Media doesn't talk about it. And politicians certainly don't talk about it, and probably don't particularly want to talk about it for the most case. But the community is ready for that conversation. And this is for me, one of the more exciting pieces of data from this research. We have a majority of Australians who agree that incomes at the top are too high and should be reduced. Actually reduced, not put a halt to, not increasing their wealth, but actually actively reduced. This is an idea that is not discussed in the mainstream, and yet we have a majority of people who feel at a gut level that this is right. Now, this to me says that this is productive territory. This is terrain that we could push into, and it would help us to escape the dominant frames that we're currently stuck in around poverty as a problem that can be fixed without addressing anything else. It helps us talk about inequality, and it helps us avoid blaming effectively people experiencing poverty for the problem of poverty. So we're effectively choosing to take our frame and put it somewhere else. And by doing so, I guarantee that you will change the way people think about the topic and how they feel about it. So that's my provocation. I think I might just stop there and pass back to Jackie.
Thanks so much, Mark. Look, let's move to discussion, and there's a sort of stream of questions coming through via the chat function, which I just had open, and now it has disappeared. Here we go. But I think the first one that I wanted to put to you was around the role of systemic stigma and I think you've addressed this in part in explaining the difference in response when the question's posed in relation to unemployment benefits as opposed to poverty as a more general or abstract issue. Carla, did you want to respond to that, given your body of work around stigma?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Stigma doesn't come from just nowhere. It's built into our culture, and you don't have to scratch the surface very hard to find numerous examples of the ways in which people receiving unemployment payments have been spoken about and portrayed in political discourse, in media of other types. And those things are sticky and get into what the literature calls swirling ambient stereotypes. So they're there, they're around us all the time. So and they feed then policies and laws and the ways in which organisations are structured, the ways in which training is constructed for people and individuals' beliefs about the worthiness of people on the outers of society as perceived in that framework and reflected in that data. So yes, systemic tackling of stigma is absolutely important, and being able to call out those terrible language and myths and stereotypes that are just thrown casually around is part of the response to this. And hopefully the data in this report is enabling to challenge those perceptions that are revealed by those stereotypes.
Did you want to add anything further on the stigma issue?
Yeah, just to say that the solution to stigma isn't necessarily just addressing the stigma directly. Often what we do when we talk about stigma is we put the spotlight yet again on people who are effectively the victims of a system, as opposed to shifting the spotlight to other elements of the system. So coming back to that sort of first frame shift I mentioned, and I just really quickly give you an example from research that illustrates this point. So an excellent piece of research, academic piece of research, not from us, which looked at talking about experiences of violence, either from the victim survivor's perspective or from the perspective of the perpetrator. And what they found is they told the exact same story with the exact same sequence of events, but one story was told from the perspective of the victim survivor, the other one from the perpetrator. Then they asked people questions about how could this have been avoided? The people who heard the story told from the perspective of the victim survivor were more likely to say, well, what could she have done differently? Right? Because all they could see were her choices. Whereas when the story was told from the perspective of the perpetrator, people were more likely to think about what they could have done differently to have avoided that situation. And so where we put the focus in our messaging is critically important, who we're focused on, who we're not. And addressing stigma in some ways is about calling it out directly when it happens, but also about strategically shifting the narrative, focusing on other actors and the things that they are doing that are creating the problem. And then remember, by conceptualism, people can hold both ideas. And it's about letting the stigma sit there and wither and not give it the attention, and focusing on strengthening the alternative, more helpful story.
So Mark, just to follow up to that comment that you made, I think it's a really interesting one and a very challenging one, I think. If we're also at the same time really committed to ensuring that people who are directly affected by policy are the ones who are talking about it and whose experiences are heard, but not just, as case studies, but their ideas about what reform should look like should also be in the mix. The risk being, as you say, that people then tend to individualize the story and see both problem and solution as sitting with the individual. So how do you do both those things at the same time, both point to the systemic drivers and pointing to government as responsible in this case, say around payment rates, whilst also ensuring that the people who are affected's voices are materially, being heard in the debate?
Yeah, totally. And because it is that tension between centering voices, right, versus the spotlight of attention and what choices we wonder about, and full empathy for people who have the job of finding these case studies and finding these messages and sort of enabling them to speak up, because it is not easy to find the perfect case study. But if I had some criteria around it, I'd say find case studies or messengers who can speak to the systemic causes. So it's not who the messenger is that is the change there. It is actually more about what they talk about, what they focus on, what are the questions we're asking case studies about in order to sort of help us focus the attention. And that is possible. It can be tricky, but it is about inviting people to share their story, but focus on systemic causes. So to bring those to light. And I should also say that in our research, we've absolutely found that it is far more effective for people to tell their own story than for us to tell their story for them in terms of shifting public support and empathy. So the two don't necessarily have to be contradictory, but there's a potential tension there to be aware of.
And I was just going to pose another question, I think, which Lisa Folks has flagged in the chat, and I had the same thought too. And I know the ACOSS CEO has too been saying a similar thing around we need to be talking more about those who have extreme wealth and the policy problems that are associated with that. And of course, the accusation that often comes when people make those kinds of statements in public life of class envy. Now, is that just an inevitable risk that you have to address and carry? I don't know that that's avoidable. What's your response to that and the way that's perceived? And also, I'm curious if that's a particularly Australian phenomenon, or whether this is something that, you know, we see in all, you know, other comparable democracies having similar debates about redistribution.
Yeah, is that for me?
Yeah, if you want to start. Yeah, thanks.
I think because I haven't done research on this very specific question, I can't say for sure. But what we tend to find is that there are obviously different perspectives on this, and what we refer to as our opposition, people who are trying to sort of create different outcomes and sort of oppositional outcomes to us, the way they frame the topic and the things that they say, just because they say them and they say them with such conviction, and there's a lot of people who we might hear echo those sentiments on social media, etc., doesn't mean that they're dominant perspectives, doesn't mean that it is a perspective that undermines ours. And so what we too often do as progressives actually is we chase the opposition's narrative. The opposition says this and we respond to it, as opposed to shaping the narrative ourselves. And therefore, when they say that's class envy, we go back to our story and we stick to it. So this is absolutely unjust. It's not right that someone has this when these people are missing out, and then we're giving more to them and taking away, and we stick to that story. I'd have to test that to know whether genuinely that is a stronger story, our narrative, than the opposition's narrative. But we often overestimate how persuasive our opposition messaging is. Most of the time, we find that some of the messages that we were most concerned about are held very, very strongly, but by a minority of people. For example, I will talk about super quick, analogous case of drug stigma. We did some research on that a couple of years ago. And what we found there is some of the messages that we were most concerned about, messages from the opposition that effectively dehumanized and blamed people who use drugs for the problems that they face, while echoed very strongly on social media, were not actually held by most people and were not accepted by most people. And all we had to do to respond to that was to remind Australians that we should look out for each other and care for each other. And that was far more persuasive for the vast majority of people than those dehumanizing messages that we thought were such a problem. There's all sorts of other problems when it comes to messaging around drugs, but that wasn't one of them. So I think we can, overestimate, and it's important not to craft our messaging in response to the opposition, but to have our own story that we know is persuasive and pursue that.
Carla, did you want to add anything on that one?
I've learned a lot from watching the TV show Billions. Maybe other people have seen it too, but it's literally about that extreme wealth of billionaires and the fight. It's all scripted, of course. There's nothing real about it, but the notion, and it's set in the US, the notion that that there's such resistance to aggressive taxation on extreme wealth because people are aspirational that it might be them one day, even though that is just not the case. It's never going to be. These are unicorn type people in the world, but that the public sentiment is protective of unicorns. So using some of that reframing to work with those resistances in community attitudes that lead then to policy discussions, I think is really interesting, because that extreme wealth story is a relatively new one for modern worlds. If we go back centuries, it might be different, but this is an interesting new area to think about as the number of billionaires increases across the country, across the world.
We might move to another question. We've got a couple to get through. One that was posed a little bit earlier on, and I know we've thought a lot about this in the context of COVID, is around how the way that community attitudes towards people who are unemployed change depending on the economic circumstances, periods of high unemployment where people might be thinking they're but for, go I, periods of low unemployment where it seems to people like a more remote possibility. Did either of you want to comment on that in terms of community attitudes? I suppose in the broader context, Mark, too, of inequality and poverty and community attitudes and how that changes depending on economic circumstances. Either of you.
We're playing chicken. Carla, do you want to go first?
Sorry, I was concentrating on writing a response to in the chat. So, Mark, I'm going to.
Okay, I'll jump on it. Yeah, look, it's I mean, COVID obviously was a huge moment in our lives, and a moment because of its significance and the depth and the duration of it had the ability or the potential to shift some of the narratives and beliefs that we have around different things. And it is hard to judge whether those shifts were temporary or permanent. One thing that we did do some research around pre-COVID, serendipitously, during COVID, and we've just done some that I got results back from last week. So sort of, I suppose you could say that's post-COVID, is pre-COVID, the belief that government plays a vital role in promoting good health and well-being in the community was tepid. There was some level of belief in that statement, but obviously during COVID, the belief in that rose significantly. People very strongly saw that government does actually play a huge role in promoting good health and well-being. So it shifted us out of that individual choice and responsibility into that collective responsibility and the role of government. And what's quite interesting is, so it lifted by something like 30 percentage points. So 30% of the population now believed it that didn't before. And since then, as of last week, that has only dropped off by maybe 4 percentage points back down, right? So it is still at that elevated level. So I would expect that some of the differences that we saw in how government can respond to problems when it chooses to can be permanent. It has changed our psyche and our understanding of what's actually possible. I don't know about this one though, because this might be something that is more deeply rooted. Obviously, the question I was monitoring was around health and well-being, which COVID was very clearly a case of. So I'm not quite sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if we are more open to systemic solutions and government playing an important and driving role in things, including the economy and unemployment now than we were pre-COVID.
Anything you want to add, Carla? Should we move to the next question?
Yes, let's go. Yeah.
I'm curious about the question, because this is something we discuss quite a lot here at ACOSS. There's a question posed, Mark, reframing about the role of human rights language and framing in strategic and persuasive, I guess, campaign framing and language, and I'm interested in your views on that, particularly, I guess, in the context of social and economic debates, which might involve some element of redistributive justice.
Yeah, human rights is an interesting one. What I would say is that our research very clearly shows that the values and principles that sit behind human rights are broadly accepted in the Australian community. They absolutely resonate. And if you can engage the sense of everyone having equal value and deserving the same respect and good outcomes in life, you will do well in your messaging. What we've also found, though, is that boiling it down to human rights to say that it is a human right and therefore we must doesn't work, because all we're doing there is saying effectively it's the law, so therefore you have to, in this case, international law more than Australian law typically. So do talk about the concept of human rights, but talk about it in the richness of the values and principles that sit behind those human rights, rather than boiling it down to some anemic statement of it is a human right, therefore we should do it. I hope that makes sense.
No, that really does. Thank you, Mark. I think that's incredibly useful. There's a question which Carla, you might respond to, or potentially even Bruce from the sidelines, which is about the representativeness of the sample. Carla, I don't know whether you've read that question, but the question specifically about whether the sample has captured the diversity of groups and listed a few different cohorts. Do you want to respond to that, Carla?
Yeah, that was what I was concentrating on, replying to the chat.
Oh, sorry.
To Ramesh, and Zara's jumped in there too. So
good. Carla's answered it in the chat, I see. Sorry, my laptop was also dying, so I was dealing with an emergency power cord situation there, so I haven't been able to keep track of the chat. So apologies if that one's been addressed. And thanks, Tony, too. I know you've shared some really great resources there in terms of the Anti-Poverty Week's work on framing and poverty, and also on some of the broader attitudes towards cohesion and inclusion, the Scanlon work that's just been posted. Okay, so just checking. Oh, I know the other question I think for you specifically, Mark, but Carla, you might want to comment, was around the idea of a wage cap. But I must say we had an interesting discussion around that question, around that perception that the incomes of those at the top are too high. Well, what are the policy implications of that? Now, for ACOSS, we probably take that and we think about potential public support for changes to taxation, particularly of taxation of wealth, where we've done quite a bit of work. But, you know, the other place to go would be around wages. It's not somewhere that we've been, but someone's posed the question of around a wage cap for those at the top. Did you want to respond to that, Mark?
Yeah, look, what we do find typically is at a broad level, at a principle level, you get strong agreement to something that makes intuitive common sense to people. As we start to put that into more specific terms, for example, a wage cap, sometimes you can see a dramatic drop-off in support, right? So that could happen for something like that, but it also depends on how we frame it and what the settings are around that and how it's communicated. So what I think we should do is we should explore more. And also what's interesting is, I can't remember what the start was, it was at 63 or 67% of support for reducing incomes at the top. I would expect that percentage to only grow the more we have that conversation, because that tends to be what happens. If we've heard something before, a concept before, we tend to be more likely to agree with it because it sounds like something that most people agree. I'm sure it's perfectly sensible to agree with that too. That's the case for some persuadable people. So I think what it shows is productive territory, but it doesn't mean it's easy work. We still need to do the work of actually starting this conversation, starting it on the right foot, and making sure that it is a constant part of the narrative rather than something that we just dip into, get a bad reaction from a few people, and then run away from and go back to what feels more comfortable and safe. But just remember that comfortable, safe means we're not actually challenging, we're not actually changing things.
Mark?
I wanted to jump in there because it picks up on a couple of questions from Pierre about the social determinants of health very rarely speak to power and class, and Zara's comment there about talking about system change with framing that resonates and avoiding being too abstract. So I've recently come across the concept of poverty truth commissions in the UK, and didn't know if this was something that other people were across. But that is definitely about a structured process where people who experience poverty have the power, they're put in situations of power to tell their story about the impact of system and structure changes under austerity frameworks in the UK and the impact of those on their life. And I'll find the link and put it into the chat. But that seemed, although, you know, the UK is still very difficult to talk about in relation to defunding of services and supports, it seems to be a very powerful way to ensure the voice of people who are experiencing this are frontline and to keep the focus on systems and structures and power.
Can I add to that? And then also I've noticed a couple of questions in the chat. One excellent point from Francesca about when we do talk about extreme wealth, we don't want to start talking about individuals. We want to keep the focus on systems, and I couldn't agree more. When we do talk about extreme wealth, we frame that as the problem. Just like we're explaining poverty is the problem, then we're pointing to systemic causes. We can talk about extreme wealth, and we can talk about the systemic causes of that rather than blaming the individuals themselves, which is not going to work very well. In addition to that, Zara asked a question about how do we talk about systems change with framing that resonates, rather than it just seeming too abstract. And I would say that when you're talking to members of the community, then you don't use the word systems. We too easily fall into that jargon, and all of a sudden people's eyes glaze over. And the reason that happens isn't because what we're talking about is boring. It's because people can't actually picture it. They have no idea what we actually mean by systems. And so it's not an easy answer for you, and it's not a complete sort of answer for you here. But I think the solution does lie, and from our experience on other issues, the solution lies in focusing on the actual actors. So that first frame shift I spoke about, you don't talk about, hey, it's not individuals, it's the system. You don't actually say it's not individuals, because that's acknowledging your opponent's frame. You start from the problem is when politicians do this, when industry or bosses do this, when bankers do that. And so we point to the systemic causes without necessarily calling it the system. So it is about putting actual actors making actual decisions. I once, when I was learning campaigning for the very first time, the way the person training me on campaigning put it was, you need to be able to paint a picture. If you could take a picture of the change you want, that's what can inspire people. So what is the physical change and those moments of decision that we want to influence and change? So it is about politicians sitting around in Parliament House and voting for tax cuts for the rich at a time when sort of cost of living, fill in that rest of that, rather than we're talking about the systemic implications of a tax-free tax cut. Talk about the choices that we're making that are fueling the problem or creating the solution.
Thanks, Mark. And this is probably the last question, I think, which is the one about the impact that the growing divide in housing in Australia is having on the way people view poverty in Australia, potentially more broadly, inequality. Seems like it's the starkest and most tangible divide, I think, that everybody is aware of and perceives. Any reflections on that from either of you?
When we released the inequality report in October from PIP, some of us were using the example of because of that massive wealth divide, with the top 20% having 90 times the wealth of the bottom 20% of households. We spoke about the inequality is continuing today. So there'll be some families that are able to help their young adults buy a house today, and there'll be many other families who have no capacity to be able to support their young people buying property, or even perhaps finding a rental in the growing escalation of property costs. That seemed to have a bit of a cut through. Again, we're talking about maybe not exactly in Mark's point of view, but talking about the system and the actors within it, and also the policy settings. Do we want this to continue for another 20 years? Because our data was looking back 20 years. Is that where the settings that we want, and what will that produce with greater building of concentrating of wealth in the hands of the few via this particular housing example?
Okay, one final one, because I think it's such a good one, which is, how do we talk about government being the cause of systemic problems while also relying on government to provide the solution without undermining trust in government and politicians?
Yeah, so this is something that we tackle all the time, because often government decisions are the problem and we need to fix them and get them to make a different choice. So it depends, again, I'd almost need a scenario, but some principles would be, you don't want to make your audience defensive. So if you are engaging with government, trying to motivate them to make a change, then telling them that they've done a bad job is not going to get you anywhere. One solution to that is to blame previous governments, to say for the last 14 years, governments have not address this. You are now the minister. You have an opportunity, a historic opportunity to make this change. And so therefore you're not blaming them, but you're giving them the opportunity to be the hero. So it's sort of like hero framing as opposed to villain framing of the government. But it also does depend on your change strategy. Perhaps you do want to build public pressure and you want to make it impossible for the government to continue to ignore the problem that maybe it's been in government for a while has created. Right. So it does depend a little bit on who is the person you're trying to really convince. If it is the public, then it's less important to not get the government offside, although government relations people wouldn't like me saying that. It all depends on your change strategy.
Yeah.
But it can be done. Think of a way of basically excusing the behavior of the decision maker for the past, but making it very clear that this is the point in time where they have all the information and knowledge to make the right choice, and therefore they will be held responsible for that.
And bang on 2 p.m. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I hope that it's been a valuable conversation for people. This is really the beginning of this sort of stream of research and investigation work for the Poverty and Inequality Partnership. So please engage with us if you're interested in this work, if you want to have input into it, you have ideas. We'd love to hear from you. You contact Carla directly or myself or Penny Dorsch. Thank you, Mark, so much for your time today. And let's keep discussing these issues and poverty, and have a wonderful break for everyone, at least those of you who are going to be able to take one. Thanks, everyone.